Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley McManus, Director of Marketing at Affectiva. Welcome to Affectiva Asks, a human-centric AI podcast where each episode we will interview a thought leader doing cutting-edge work in the AI space. A little bit about us. Affectiva is the pioneer of emotion AI, software that can detect nuanced human emotions, complex cognitive states, behaviors, activities, and interactions. And Affectiva is applying this technology to optimize brand content and media spend by measuring consumer emotional responses to videos, ads, and TV shows, unobtrusively and at scale. Today's episode features Terrence Scroop, Vice President of Insights and Solutions at Unruly. Affectiva partners with Unruly to bring emotional intelligence to digital advertising. Our emotion recognition technology is actually integrated into Unruly EQ, a content evaluation tool that helps advertisers maximize the emotional and business impact of ads. Terrence and I had a super interesting conversation around some of the research work he has done, especially around gender stereotypes in U.S. advertising, ads surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement, and much more. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. With me today, I have Terrence Scroop, Vice President of Insights and Solutions of Unruly EQ at Unruly. Terrence, thank you so much for making the time to speak with me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So to start, let's talk about your background. How has your career path taken you to Unruly, and what is your current role?
Sure. So I've had a somewhat circuitous route through the industry. I started off at a company called MMA, which is now part of Ipsos, and I was running those MMA reports, love them or loathe them, but it was a great kind of first entry into the industry and understanding kind of how the full marketing picture works and comes together. And went from MMA to a company called X+1, which is now part of Rocket Fuel and how Rocket Fuel has spun into something new. And that was kind of my first foray and introduction into the world of programmatic. And it was the very early days of programmatic. So we were kind of learning as we went back then, and branching out into whole other areas like website optimization. But it was a really interesting kind of first couple of years of my career. And then after that, I made the leap into the big agency world. I spent a couple of years at Cara, first working on their advanced analytics team, and doing modeling efforts on that, and eventually making a switch over into their consumer research team. And after my time at Cara, I went to Mindshare. And at Mindshare, I ran a program and approach they call the Loop, which is how they adjust and optimize their campaigns around adaptive moments in culture, which was really interesting, fascinating, and challenging time. And 2 years ago, I left Mindshare and I came to Unruly, where I am now. I'm the Vice President of Insights and Solutions for North America, and kind of, took a step back from the agency world, wanted to see and learn a little bit more about the supply and demand side of the industry, and also Unruly's really unique approach to research and kind of utilizing behavioral studies and emotional studies to kind of bring a really interesting different element into play for marketing kind of attracted me. And it's been a really great run at Unruly so far, and just the amount of bandwidth and latitude we're given with research is really, really interesting.
Excellent. So for those of listeners who are unfamiliar with Unruly, can you explain briefly what your offerings are?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a data-driven video marketplace. Traditionally, our focus has been in the digital video channels, but very recently we were acquired at the beginning of 2020 by Tremor International, which adds a very interesting new component to what we bring to the market. So on top of all that digital video heritage we have, we're now also set up to work in the CTV space, which is a wholly different animal, and we're learning very quickly what that means. And for both our traditional offering and now for CTV as well. One thing that we do to bring kind of a differentiator into the marketplace is that we focus very heavily on that unique emotional testing I referenced, and also converting that into targeting capabilities. So targeting against consumers, not just traditional demographics, but also thinking about behavioral and attitudinal mindsets, and also those consumers that have the highest emotional engagement with certain ads. Really brings a different element and approach to targeting in the digital world. And then, of course, we're backed up with industry-leading brand safety and a really unique premium inventory list.
What kind of value have you gotten, or what kind of results have you seen from the Affectiva's technology integration?
Yeah, absolutely. Affectiva is an incredibly valued partner of us at Unruly, and especially for my team, the EQ team. EQ stands for emotional quotient. We invest in research that takes into account two different systems of data. The first is based on surveys. So when we do our testing, we are recruiting panels and we are exposing them to different advertisements, and we are collecting their responses in a survey format. But then we are also getting a percentage of those panelists to agree to do facial coding. And so that's the biometric data that Affectiva brings to play. And it provides an incredibly valuable tool in terms of contextualizing the results that we get out of that survey. And we utilize that, as I said before, to build different audiences and derive insights about how the ad is performing and what elements of it are strong, what elements of it are weak. And then one of the other things that we offer at Unruly is the ability to make edits and creative corrections in those ads. So the idea of giving our clients the ability to course correct, make adjustments, optimize, even after an ad has been taken out of traditional production, we can utilize that data that Affectiva provides us to understand exactly which themes and which characters are the strongest, when we are maximizing attention and when we are losing the audience, and further add to that kind of robust cohort of consumers that are really leaning into an ad and help direct our clients in terms of how to find them and capitalize them in the marketplace. So we have a really strong bond with Affectiva, and the value is great. And we're really excited about this next chapter that we're starting with you guys, where we're going to, I think, invest more in some mutual research and really kind of continue to kind of drive that position we've both built in the market as thought leaders and kind of bringing the best of both of our suites together.
Wonderful. Excellent. Okay. So let's move on to talk about some of the work that you've done. So the first thing I want to ask you about is this talk that you delivered at CES 2020. In this presentation, you dove into the presence and intensity of gender stereotypes in U.S. advertising, highlighting the consequences that negative stereotypes can have on business metrics like purchase intent, brand building, brand favorability. We'll link to it, so I encourage listeners to go take a look. But can you give us some highlights from that study? You know, what was your methodology, your findings, some takeaways? Was there anything that surprised you?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to talk about there. I think maybe the first place to start is just kind of why we decided to do this and why we decided to focus on stereotypes in advertising. And the rationale is multifaceted. I think that it's coming from a couple different areas. First, we were already kind of seeing this in our research. Occasionally, in an ad that we would test, we ask our panelists for verbatims and their responses in the positive and the negative. And we were already starting to get some of that feedback on a fairly regular cadence of people objecting to certain images or approaches, et cetera. And so we knew that there was something there, even if we didn't necessarily see it on the surface. And that's what's so great about our research, is it does uncover and kind of turns every stone. So we already were seeing that we were set up in a way to kind of take advantage and learn more about this. And it just took a little bit of finesse to kind of adjust our approach slightly to focus even more on it. We also saw that there was a real reaction already in the industry to tackling and kind of improving and holding ourselves to a higher standard when it comes to stereotypes in advertising. And we saw the United Nations had formed a coalition essentially with advertisers and agencies to really focus on this and again, kind of just hold the industry to a much higher standard as it relates to this. And then there was also the ASA, the Advertising Standards Authority, actually had kind of made an interesting claim in the marketplace, or not a claim so much as a statement, that they were going to start policing, in the UK at least, advertisements for stereotypes, and would be releasing the results when they found an ad that didn't test to their standards. And everybody, I think, thought that was interesting and certainly move in the right direction. And then what actually happened in Q4 of 2019 was that the ASA actually shot their first hits across the bow, and they actually called out 2 ads in the UK that they felt propagated negative stereotypes. And it was interesting because it gave us our first kind of example of what we could look at and what the reaction was. And so those two ads, and they are in the study that you referenced, were very different animals. So the first one was from Volkswagen, and it was for their new electronic car. And in brief summary, it's a series of really quick video vignettes of just people achieving amazing things. So you see some astronauts kind of floating in their capsule in space. You see an extreme rock climber. You see a para athlete, and then it kind of has some text overlay implying that human evolution is amazing and we have achieved crazy things. And then it shifts to this image of the electric car kind of driving by a woman on a park bench next to a baby carriage. And on the surface, it seems like an inspirational, nice video. The objection and the reason that it got called out was because of misrepresentation or unequal representation. And so all of those series of images I talked about, the rock climber, the astronauts, the para athlete, they all happen to be men. And then you close on this very static image of a mother. And it was the juxtaposition of the characters in this ad that kind of implied that a woman's place is for child rearing, and that's what she is capable of and contributing to kind of the larger human movement, whereas men are achieving all these amazing things. So certainly on this, when you take it through that lens, you can see what the issue is. At the same time, it's a very fixable problem. So in our content testing, we would have picked up that same kind of, why is it all men doing this, et cetera. And because of the way that ad is structured, you could really easily swap one or two of those series in the vignette out, and you could completely change the entire tone, the argument. Mm-hmm. Now, the other ad that they called out was, like I said, a wholly different animal, and it was for Philadelphia cream cheese of all brands. And in that ad, you see two young fathers with toddlers or infants, and they're at a restaurant with a conveyor belt on it where like dishes are going by to kind of entice the eaters. And they're obviously both being left in charge of their children, and they are almost immediately distracted by the sight of bagels with cream cheese on them, and just put their babies on the conveyor belt and send them off to harm's way. And so it kind of conveyed this very, it's comedic, and it still had its value in terms of like, you would smile and you might chuckle at the ad, but it reinforces a very negative stereotype about fathers and what fathers are capable of. And we looked into some stats about this, and it is something that we have to keep in mind as advertisers, is that we do still play a role in terms of the broader consciousness and kind of reinforcing these positive and negative stereotypes. And when we looked at the stats, we found a really interesting stat that in, I think, 1980, there was a survey of U.S. fathers that was done. And it found that, I believe, only 30% of U.S. fathers had ever changed one of their own children's diapers.
Oh my God.
I know, it's crazy. That same question was asked only 2 years ago, and the numbers had changed that only 3% of fathers had never changed their baby's diaper. Wow. So a pretty dramatic shift in only a few short decades. So obviously we know from our own experience, roles are constantly changing. Societal expectations, the way the family unit is structured is changing. And so it's important for advertising, like all content, to reflect that and kind of celebrate the positive, but certainly not enhance the negative or kind of fall back on these old, antiquated approaches to how the family is structured and what a person is capable of or expected to do. So that was kind of the catalyst as to why we started to lean into this space. Mm-hmm. And what we did was, at CES this year, we did hand select a series of videos to test that we saw as either having explicit or implicit stereotypes in them, and balance those out with ads that we felt were very progressive. And then we also asked a handful of our close clients to also submit videos for testing, which was good because some of them somewhat veered off of the path of how we had written that brief, and we got videos that we wouldn't necessarily have chosen. We didn't see them having really a horse in the race in either of those regards, but they helped to balance out what we saw in the end in terms of having a comprehensive and broad picture of advertising and how it's received by clients. And to get to the final point of the question is, what did we see in terms of insights? We found some really interesting things. And I think the lead headline is that no ad is above reproach, essentially. Again, like I said, we tested ads that we knew would have issues and would cause issues. We tested some ads that were incredibly progressive in our mind. And no ad came out completely unscathed. Every ad had a percentage of people recognizing a stereotype in it. And it's important to note, even though we did focus on gender for this particular study at CES, we actually have changed our testing to record 7 different categories of stereotypes, which have been kind of formalized in the same kind of approach the ASA and the United Nations are using. And so those are gender, sexuality, age, ethnicity, social class, disability, and religion. And so we were asking all of those questions simultaneously and finding out if consumers saw any issue in the positive or the negative. We were also asking if people saw a positive portrayal of a stereotype or defeating a stereotype, essentially.
Yeah.
And that was one of the interesting things was that, like I said, every ad had some degree of negative. And one of our clients, actually, when we were presenting it, she stopped me and she goes, wait, so nobody got 100? And I was like, nope, nobody got the mythical A+, theoretically. Everybody has, it has some type of a scar coming out of this. And there's a lot of rationales behind that. And like I said, some of them were not surprised to see those results. But you also have to remember that in the medium that we're working on in advertising, it's a very short format. And we know from our results with Affectiva, maintaining attention is oftentimes one of the biggest challenges for advertising. And when you're working in a 30-second window, if you look away for 6 seconds, you've missed a significant percentage of that ad. So you could miss a character, you could miss a fundamental part of the narrative. You could be on a completely different page than everybody else for what the intention of that ad is. So there's some percentage of that negative that we're seeing that is noise, for lack of a better term. It's people misunderstanding, misinterpreting the actual ad. But beyond that, there are other aspects that kind of, when we hit a certain threshold and we see a certain percentage of negative, that's when I think we start to, we're kind of forming around that being the point of attention, where in our testing moving forward, we'll know what the benchmark is essentially. And when an ad starts to significantly exceed that, or even just start to kind of break that benchmark level, it deserves further attention and further analysis to understand exactly what's going on there. So that's kind of like the big takeaway. And we've, like I said, done more testing since then. And so we're refining what that benchmark level is. And it's going to vary a little bit by each of those different 7 categories I talked about. And also kind of the approach that a different ad is taking, whether it be obviously some ads and a lot of brands are leaning into social cause marketing now. So obviously that is by nature almost designed to provoke consumers. And so there's going to be a different expectation and a different level of response that we see coming out of that. The other things that we saw that were really interesting that we've seen repeated, oftentimes when brands try to go down these narratives that are a little bit challenging for the consumers, if they're trying to deal with things like the gender pay gap, for example, one way that some brands try to deal with that perhaps uncomfortable topic is to use children in the narrative. So they replace adults with children and they use children as narrators. And it's an interesting tactic and it does work frequently. It mitigates kind of the shock value, if you will, because children can be so disarming. There's even a way, and some brands use it to really play into their narrative to talk about the future. So it is a really powerful tool, but it can backfire at the same time. If the topic is too adult, people will object to the children being incorporated into that or feel the children are being exploited in that regard. And it's actually interesting because just last week I saw a headline, I think in Adweek, that was about a print ad for Audi, actually, for one of their new cars. And it featured a 5-year-old girl kind of just like leaning up against the grill of the car with sunglasses on, and she's like eating a banana. And on the surface, it seems completely innocent and it's just trying to like be a cutesy ad, but people objected to it. They felt like the child was being sexualized. They felt that it sent the wrong message about putting the child in front of the car and the implications of like head-on collisions and striking pedestrians, et cetera. So it's always interesting. And I think that's one of our big points is that this type of content testing has great value for consumers because everybody has their own lens and their own view of the world, and it's shaped by different things. And so getting that collective response and feedback is really important in terms of kind of broadening your horizons and making sure you're looking at it through many, many different eyes, essentially. And
Wow.
then the last point, I'll make one more point in terms of kind of the key takeaways. Like I said before, the social cause marketing is something that in a great right has become very in vogue. And so you see a lot more brands leaning into it, taking political positions, taking positions about the environment, so on and so forth. And one of the things that we always test for in our ads is contempt, and we want to understand when people kind of have an issue with the ad. And what we see with social cause marketing frequently is that there is an elevated level of contempt. It's not huge, but it definitely exceeds our standard benchmark. And the reason, or how we have rationalized that, kind of looking at all the data and all the testing we've done, is that there's a degree of cynicism that a lot of consumers layer on to this kind of social cause marketing, especially in markets like the US and the UK. We always are curious or questioning as to the motives of brands. And when you see a brand, a large scale CPG brand or an athletic brand kind of talking about something that seems so far removed from their home base, that they're talking about the environment, that they're talking about anything that doesn't really sell the product, a certain percentage of consumers are always going to kind of say, is this authentic? Is this real? Or are they just trying to play to my emotions and kind of trick me into like thinking differently about the brand? So that's kind of a write-off. You have to assume there's always going to be those people that want to kind of question your motives, et cetera. But one way that we saw in the ads that certain brands kind of almost were prepared for that kind of a backlash is they rationalized their advertising narrative with statistics and figures. So rather than just launching into a diatribe about why you should be better or why you should do this or et cetera, they actually cite hard numbers and figures and say, this is an issue. And here are the stats to back it up. And this is why we're talking about it. And I think that consumers, for the most part, are coming around and starting to understand that brands are recognizing their power, they're recognizing their reach and their voice and their influence, and they're utilizing it. And less so are consumers kind of broadly writing them off in that regard. They're still going to fray some edges, and they're going to cause some people to kind of call them out or object to what they're saying. But the brands are finding that there is, especially in terms of long-term brand building, a huge benefit to kind of taking a side in culture wars and in certain motivations and topics that are particularly relevant in the zeitgeist.
Wow, that is so incredibly interesting. Just keep talking about that for like 3 hours. It's just so cool. Okay, so after this study,
yep.
You went on to test a number of ads from the Super Bowl. What did you learn about from those ads? We're always interested in the angle of, emotional responses, but did you have any insights for big brands maybe planning out their 2021 ad campaigns?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did test almost all the Super Bowl ads this year, like you said, which really was a significant increase in the sample that we were looking at. So we could start to see some real trends emerge. And one thing that was crystal clear when we tested those ads, and I think one of the other things that made the Super Bowl suite of data interesting was that, like I said before, we hand selected the first round of ads that we tested. These were kind of just what was out there. So they didn't necessarily have any specific aim necessarily. I mean, they're attention getting, they're Super Bowl ads. So by their design and nature, that's how they are. But there wasn't necessarily kind of that progressive message, or we weren't hand selecting things that we felt had kind of low key stereotypes in them. It was just what we were handed by the Super Bowl, essentially.
Right.
And what we saw was some really strong correlations between the presence of negative stereotypes. So any of those 7 categories I talked about before, if any of them are elevated, kind of above that benchmark that we're looking at, which is somewhere relatively in the 8 to 11% range for depending on which one we're talking about, we start to see a drop off in some of the key brand KPIs that we measure at Unruly. So those being brand favorability, first and foremost. There's almost a direct correlation between negative stereotypes and brand favorability falling off. So that's very important, especially when you're thinking about building your brand and what your brand stands for. And then in terms of some of the short-term goals as well, so the desire to find out more and the desire to purchase, those also fell off precipitously at the higher the negative stereotype was present there. And the inverse is a fact as well. So some ads, like I said before, we were asking if people felt there was a progressive portrayal in the ads. The ads that had the highest level of positive in that regard also saw the greatest benefit in terms of their brand KPIs. So it seems like a very logical line to draw between negative stereotypes kind of sinking the ship essentially and positive portrayals really working out. And not all the positive portrayals were universal, if you will. Some ads that we tested, especially in the realm of sexuality, had a very kind of conflicted level of response. So we would have some really high positives, and then you'd have elevated, not the highest, but you still have elevated negative. And sexuality takes a lot of form. Obviously, it's reflective of the LGBT community, but it's also sexualization in general. Some ads that didn't actually have that as the topic. It's interesting what people pick up on and that they react to. Sometimes just the presence of bare skin, a person being shirtless, a man being shirtless, people being in bed, lying in bed together. People paint their own pictures and they fill in the blank spots in those narratives. And so sexuality is still a very taboo topic, especially I think in the United States, because it pulls in other aspects like religion and morality, and people have very conflicting views in that regard. The other things about the Super Bowl that were interesting was that we had some political ads. I'm not sure if you remember, but we did have a Trump ad, and we also had a Bloomberg ad for the very brief Bloomberg campaign. And what's interesting there, and I won't get into anything political in this regard, but I think it makes another point, which is that celebrity has a lot of layers to it. And we had actually seen this in other ads as well, where whether or not the celebrity is saying something controversial, their whole history and all of their baggage kind of comes along with it. So you have to be, as a brand, incredibly thorough in terms of vetting who your brand ambassadors are and who your influencers are. And so I'll stray away from the politics here, but we tested other ads. I remember the first thing that caught my attention that kind of led me towards this path of where the team has gone with on stereotype. We tested a fashion ad, and regardless of the overall results, we got some feedback that it was anti-Semitic, and we kind of were puzzled by it because it had no dialogue in the ad. It featured a group of celebrities, and we literally poured over every scene. We were looking for hidden imagery. Maybe something was in a wallpaper in the background, or God knows what. Yeah. But then when we finally got down to it, we discovered that one of the 4 brand ambassadors had made some really strong statements in regards to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the past. And that was actually what somebody had taken away, and they had associated with the celebrity, and vis-a-vis that haloed onto the brand. So you have to remember that it's not all on the surface. Sometimes people read into character actors and celebrity, et cetera, in a very significant way. So I think that's interesting. The political ads did not do very well in terms of driving positive stereotypes. I'll say that. And so you can imagine what the brand KPI impact is in that regard. And then there are some other things that I think we're still trying to understand and learn more about. Cartoons, animation is a little bit of an anomaly as it comes to this testing and what people take away, and the way that those ads scored was surprising to us. And there probably are more layers there that we have to do more testing to fully understand. And then your casting. I mean, this might seem very much on the surface, but how your casting is portrayed and how diverse it is on the obvious side, that has an impact on your ethnicity, but it doesn't have to be a cast of thousands in order to kind of reflect a fully diverse kind of approach. It can just be a group of 3 actors, and as long as there is representation there, that can work, and that can still drive really positive scores in terms of stereotyping. Having an entirely white cast, an entirely black cast, that obviously does something different to the tone of the ad and what people are taking away. So kind of just being cognizant of that as you're planning out how your ad looks is very, very important. But yeah, the Super Bowl study really helped to round out our results. And then moving forward, what we've actually done now is we've incorporated that on stereotype suite of questions into our standard survey. So now every ad that we test for our clients will have questions about presence of stereotypes and how people are perceiving them. And we've also interestingly expanded that to include a sustainability message, which might seem like a little bit of a departure, but there are brands also that are very focused on how lifestyles are portrayed in the ads and whether or not they're showing wasteful behaviors, or if they are kind of trying to, again, slowly, subconsciously infuse that more sustainable message and lifestyle into consumers' mindsets. So we're also asking questions about sustainability, which will be an interesting place for us to kind of gather learnings and maybe revisit this conversation a couple of months down the road when we've had a bit more of a sample there. But it'll be something that we're looking at, and we're finding more and more trends and patterns as time goes on.
Nice. Yeah, as you were talking, I was like struggling to remember all the Super Bowl ads. It feels like years ago that the Super Bowl was, like approximately 87 marches or so.
Yes, exactly. 2020 is the longest
so
year
far
in history.
So funny. Okay, so then more recently, I believe you've also been testing some ads around the Black Lives Matter movement. Can you speak to a couple of those data points?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we have tested a handful of those ads that have come out recently, and we've seen some interesting patterns in terms of how brands have been tackling. And so if you think back to the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the time that we're living in right now, you can remember that every brand kind of rushed to get their message out into the marketplace. And it was always a message of solidarity and like things not being normal and recovery, et cetera. And then the backlash to that, of course, was the montages that were made of like everybody used the same exact like sad soundtrack in the background and had images of this and images of that. And it was very formulaic kind of.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how that happens because obviously all these creative teams are working in isolation of each other, but the human spirit and ingenuity kind of sometimes leads to the same place. What we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter ads is some of the same. There definitely are some similar approaches being utilized, and some are more effective than others. So generally speaking, more of the ads than not steered away from having a narrator and didn't really focus on any spoken audio at all. A lot of the ads still use that somber music I just kind of referenced from COVID-19, but to a certain intent this time. I think it's, even if you have just a disembodied narrator, that's still, people still associate voices with certain people, and they can paint an image of the narrator even if the narrator is not present. So sometimes it's very important when you're trying to show this kind of a universal message, and you're trying to really convey empathy, it's almost better just to pull that narrator out of the equation so it's not even there to react to. And then what a lot of the brands did, which was really interesting since they obviously weren't using a narrator, but they still wanted to get a message across, was that they used text overlays. And what we know from our research and from Affectiva's research is that when you do kind of pull out that audio element, you are forcing the consumer to engage in a very different way. So they basically are code switching in their brain from kind of a pull scenario where all of the information is being delivered to them very easily to a scenario where they have to kind of lean in and really focus on what's being written. It awakens a different part of the brain. And so it can drive knowledge up significantly, which is, again, what these brands want to do. They want to really kind of get people to lean in, pay attention, and also notice that they are making a statement in total. Now, in terms of that approach, there seems to be a bit of a difference in terms of how deep the brands are willing to go. So the ads that tested with no audio and just kind of made these broad statements about solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, they did well. None of the ads that we tested really did that poorly or caused too much controversy, honestly. But the ads that kind of use that same formula of no audio, but then also utilize the names of some of the figures, the victims who have become kind of the part of the masthead of the Black Lives Matter movement. So Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, those ads had that much more impact. So McDonald's actually did a really, really great ad where not only did they make statements about how they were supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, but they also said that those people that have died, they are us. They are our managers. They are our kitchen staff. They are our customers, et cetera. So they really drove up the level of empathy and relatability in a very significant way beyond just kind of making broader statements. Now, some other ads actually did use narratives, if you will, to tell their story. Or just narrators. The NFL did a really powerful ad where they actually utilized a huge number of their sports talent, and it wasn't the NFL. It was put together by the actual Players Association. And in that instance, again, you saw all of these famous football players actually saying that they are these victims. Like they're reciting their names. They're saying, I am this person. I am this person. And then they're making a really pointed call to the actual league, to the NFL, making a list of demands in terms of what they want the NFL to do to improve. And again, really impactful in the sense that it drove up all of our brand KPIs. The desire to find out more was very significant. It was over 18% higher than our normal purchase intent, which maybe doesn't translate necessarily for the NFL, but it can be an indicator of just how the ad is being received and affinity for the actual product or brand. That was also significantly higher than our benchmark. So these ads, even though they're controversial, can still really do a lot to kind of lift the brand persona and establish kind of a brand's position relative to its competitors. Because when a brand does make a bold statement like this, they basically are dropping the mic for everybody that they're competing against and kind of saying, this is where we stand.
Yeah.
You have to decide where you stand relative to us. And sometimes just ignoring the conversation casts a very negative light on the competitor, because doing nothing can be worse than doing something, essentially. So it's an interesting kind of strategic game there that some of the brands are playing in terms of kind of being first movers and making these really strong statements.
Definitely. To talk more about, what's next for Unruly. I know we've spoken about it, but I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of a teaser on the CTV study you conducted. I know that we're targeting to release that later this month, September 2020 timeframe. Can you say a little bit about what the study was and some stats or results you found surrounding it?
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to. So it's interesting. Like I said before, with the Tremor International acquisition at the beginning of 2020, we've had to pivot and adjust our understanding of our media landscape significantly, as CTV is now part of our credentials. And it's interesting because the first kind of lead into these results came at the beginning of the whole pandemic. And so when obviously everybody had to adjust and shift kind of their business model on the fly, one thing that we did really great at Unruly and Tremor was that we really leaned into the research. And my team really took a strong lead with our marketing team to kind of figure out how we can kind of shift our traditional studies and focus more on kind of how the consumer mindset is shifting right now and what are they doing differently. And that was kind of the beginning of what kind of led into this survey, because one of the questions we asked about was how consumers were utilizing devices and different media outlets now that they were homebound, that states were going under lockdown, et cetera. And it was interesting because right after mobile, CTV, so streaming devices and smart TVs, saw the most significant uplift in people saying that they were using those devices a lot more or just more than they had been previously. So we already knew that kind of everybody being stuck in the household was going to lead to some type of uptick in media, but it wasn't necessarily all even. It wasn't that everybody's using all their different devices and they were using all their different media outlets the same. They were discovering and gravitating towards some more than others. And so CTV kind of having that really significant uplift was one of the interesting kind of catalysts for what then became a much more in-depth CTV survey. So at the beginning of July of 2020, we actually did employ a survey in the US and the UK that covered around 2,400 consumers. And subsequently, we've also fielded that survey in several other markets in Germany and several Asian markets as well. And some of the headlines that are really interesting. First of all, 80% of the US market is accessing CTV in some way, shape, or form now. Wow. So it's there. It's definitely competing with the big boys in terms of penetration, and it's growing really, really rapidly. Yeah. And that's one of the interesting things that, as it relates to this weird moment in history that we're sitting in right now. So we asked our panelists how many of them had tried a new ad-supported streaming service since the outbreak began, and 35% So a third of everybody said that they had tried some new streaming service that had ads incorporated in it. And subsequently, if those people answered in the affirmative, we also asked them if they were intending to keep that service or continue on. And almost 80% of them said they were. So this has been an amazing kind of sampling moment in time for CTV. And it's obviously going to have a real impact in terms of consumers' long-term habits and preferences going down the road. And then we also know that the CTV environment is just so different from the linear TV environment. It's based on different data. There are more data points to lock in on. And consumers are becoming more and more aware of that fact, I think. They understand, for better or worse, that their advertising is targeted. And eventually, when they actually get targeted with an ad that they like or that maybe has relevance, I think that's when they start to see the light and it starts to be less Big Brother-ish and more of a convenience. And what we're seeing is that kind of play out in terms of the responses we saw in our survey, in terms of we compared those consumers that had a CTV device or access versus those that strictly watched linear TV. So a really significant uplift in terms of just how the CTV audience is engaging with their ads and what they're taking away from their ads. And so I think there's two things there. It's one, the CTV experience is obviously just superior to the linear TV experience on a whole host of different markers. I mean, choosing your own programming, et cetera, and the profile that kind of is developed about the consumer. And then the CTV audience itself, those people that are watching and engaging with CTV are just intrinsically different from the linear TV audience. They're just switched on in a very different way. And so there are demographic features that obviously are different. It does skew younger than the linear TV audience, which obviously is important for brands. But also just the likelihood that they are to take certain actions is really important as well, and has incredible value when a brand or an agency is planning out their 2021 planning. CTV is a really engaging environment, which still has an incredible attention metric attached to it. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, where you have that degree of digital targeting precision, but then also that massive reach of TV.
Yeah, super interesting. So I know we've talked a lot about a lot of different studies and research, but based on your work, if you had one takeaway for the audience listening today, what would you like to tell them?
Yeah, well, I think especially given the topic, how we're looking at stereotypes, et cetera, it's very important. And this is a challenge kind of going back to my own days on the agency side of doing that balancing act between long-term brand effects and short-term activation. I think that a lot of brands, a lot of clients get very caught up in like the immediate impact of advertising and being able to see things come off the shelf the next week in the store. But what we're talking about here with brand building and being cognizant of how your brand is portrayed in the story that they're putting into the marketplace, that has long-term effects. And those should not be written off as not being able to be seen in a balance sheet immediately. You have to think about building your brand for the long term and really investing in its value and what it stands for. I think that we have to remember that we are in a very different environment in this day and age. And part of what we talked about at CES is just this whole concept of cancel culture and the lean in movement, et cetera. Our culture is changing very, very quickly, and brands have to be ready to adapt to that. And not all of them are, and not all of them are moving fast enough. And so it's very important, I think, for marketers to be able to kind of tell that story back to their clients in terms of doing that balancing act between the short term and the long term, because both of them really play an important role in terms of the health of a brand. And we've also done studies. And so if there's ever interest, and you can always go to our website and look at it, we've done studies with Peter Field to kind of see what that impact is in terms of capitalizing on emotional campaigns and driving long-term brand effects, because there is some really compelling data there to just show that having that kind of emotional connection with consumers through advertising does pay dividends in the long term.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think you kind of answered my next question, but if there's for our listeners, if there is any call to action you have for them, or if you can direct them where to go to find more info, let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, beyond that, I would just say I'd hark back to that statement I made about that one client kind of saying nobody got 100. I think that chasing that holy grail of advertising, that perfect ad that offends nobody is not possible, and especially kind of in the environment that we are all living in right now, where there is so much focus put on everything that we say and how we portray ourselves, that having that perfect ad is really challenging. But obviously, what we can do at Unruly is advise our clients and in a whole host of different ways in terms of making them aware of any potential issues and pitfalls in that content testing result, being able to help them edit that on the fly and not have to go back to costly and expensive and lengthy production cycles, but we can actually kind of fix it for you the same week that we test it, essentially. So I think both of those things are important and valuable things for marketers to focus on. And the other thing is that we do have a very quick turnaround for our content testing. And even though it might seem like another step in the process of getting your ad prepared, it's good to have kind of the background and be prepared if something does happen with your ad. If somebody does decide to call you out or take issue with it, you do have that many more data points to fall back on and show that you did your due diligence in terms of testing the ad, and be prepared also for how the cookie crumbles, essentially. I think that one of the great examples we had from our first test was actually the now infamous Peloton ad, which came out around the holiday season. And kind of the negative reaction in the trade press, obviously, was that it portrayed a very unhealthy relationship with a husband buying a wife exercise equipment. But to some degree, a lot of that story was really manufactured by the press, if you will. And when we did our testing, some people saw that issue and they took issue with it, but there was actually a huge positive reaction to that ad. And people saw the character as being on her fitness journey. People were like, if my husband bought me that expensive bike, I'd love him forever. So there's a multitude of responses to that ad. But we also saw the negative. And in that scenario, we could have given Peloton talking points and helped their PR agency in terms of how to really take that issue, which got totally out of control, and kind of address it upfront and quickly put it to bed.
Great. Awesome. Well, that is all I have for you today. Terrence, once again, thank you so much for your time. It was such a pleasure speaking with you.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much, Ashley.
Terrence had some really fascinating data, and I loved his takeaway for brands to consider today's environment when thinking about the balancing act between long-term brand effects and short-term brand activation. While it's tempting to get caught up in the immediate impact of advertising, brands need to be really thoughtful about what they say and how it will represent what their brand stands for in the long term. I also was personally horrified at the 1980 stat, which wasn't too long ago, of only 30% of U.S. fathers had ever changed their own children's diaper. I'm glad to see that number is down to 3% today, so we've definitely come a long way. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe to Affectiva's Human-Centric AI podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts for more episodes. We are also on social media, so please reach out to us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Affectiva to share any feedback you have on the show and weigh in on the discussion using hashtag AffectivaAsks. Don't forget to rate us and comment with your feedback to help make the podcast more discoverable for others. Until next time, thanks for listening.